So I'm Chris Marangi, it's Kevin Dreyer. With all the headlines about Uber and Lyft and Pinterest and growth and value and active and passive management, Kevin and I thought it would be useful for us to discuss how our fundamental value methodology is relevant today. So one of my favorite things about being a parent is getting to take fifth grade social studies again and again and again and again in my case. And one of the things you'll learn the second go around is that the first financial transactions happened in 1600 BC in Sumeria, and this is one of the very first futures contracts. You also learn that old Peter Minuit got quite the bargain in 1626 when he purchased Manhattan Island for the then price of $24. But what you don't know is that the Canarsies actually didn't have any claim at all to Manhattan. So this is probably, since they were from the neighboring future borough, the first time the Brooklyn Bridge has gotten sold. Of course, what we're more concerned about is the history of modern value investing. And that clearly begins in 1934 with the publishing of Benjamin Graham and David Dodd's Security Analysis. And if you look hard, you'll be able to see that our Gabelli Prize recipient, Bruce Greenwald, added some commentary to that edition. He wrote that recently, not in 1934. He's been around a long time, but not that long. And in this book, our Bible, we're introduced concepts like intrinsic value, liquidation value, and margin of safety. Graham's student, Warren Buffett, added to the value canon with concepts like franchise value and many other things. And Graham's successor, Professor Roger Murray, had a student, who we all know, who added private market value with a catalyst, marrying what an informed buyer would pay to own the entirety of a business with events that narrow or eliminate that discount to public market price. Now, thankfully, history didn't end in 1977. The economy continues to evolve. Value investing continues to evolve and be added to, but I would argue all value investors share at least two characteristics. First, fundamental research, as opposed to looking at charts or earnings momentum. I will say that research intensity can vary, but in our case, we take GAPIC, gathering, arraying, projecting, interpreting, communicating, very, very seriously, and our analysts dominate the knowledge of the industries that they cover. Second, everyone's looking for a margin of safety, colloquially looking for those 75-cent dollars. Now, that brings a question of what dollar are we talking about? Is it a dollar today? Is it a dollar tomorrow? Is paying 75 cents for a dollar today the equivalent of paying a dollar for $1.33 in the future? And without getting too cute or too academic, let me establish two things. First, a dollar today is worth more in most places than a dollar tomorrow. That's because you can put $1 million in risk-free treasuries or better, 100% Gabelli U.S. money market fund, Gusto, and get $1,025,000 in a year, state and local tax-free, I might add. And second, a company is worth the sum of its future discounted cash flows. With that established, I've got two companies here, two sets of cash flows. Company A, which is a mature company growing at something like GDP, and Company B, which looks a lot like some of these companies going public, losing gobs of money in hopes for future profits. In the trade, we call Company B the hockey stick. Now, with my very basic and probably erroneous assumption that we use the same discount rate for each company, their value is exactly equivalent. But if I offered you each company, most of you would probably choose Company A because of the intuition that Company B is riskier. Humans just aren't very good at predicting the future, and they're even worse at picking out points of change. But what I left out, importantly, is what I would sell you each company for, their price. Price is what you pay, value is what you get. And in the case where if I offered you Company A for a price that fully reflects its value, it wouldn't be a value stock. Whereas if I offered you Company B at an appropriate discount, it could be a growing company, but a value stock, if the margin of safety is appropriate. And how do we determine what appropriate margin of safety might be? Well, again, it's having analysts who understand the growth trajectory of those companies. And this has been the case with a couple of companies that I've talked about on the stage in years prior. Harvests like Cablevision and DirecTV, whose growth paths over several decades look exactly like Company B. Let me just stick with company A and company B, but digress a little bit to talk about interest rates, because interest rates are critical. And in a world of low interest rates, all else equal, asset prices are higher. I think we all know that. You watch what happens to the stock market when the Fed talks. But the impact is not even. In fact, companies whose cash flows are biased toward the future tend to do better in a low interest rate environment because those cash flows get discounted less, and it's easier for them to overcome the near-term losses. Of course, the inverse is also true, but that's one reason that growth has done well of late. Another is that low rates have allowed companies that are over-leveraged and under-earning to stick around for a longer time, and in fact have allowed companies like some of these to price goods below cost and last for a longer time than they might in a normal interest rate environment. Now, interest rates will go up. That'll change at some point. I don't know when. But that's the world that we live with today. It's the world we've lived with for much of the last decade. And that's been accompanied, certainly, by rapid change in technology and an evolution in culture, all of which are self-reinforcing. So if it seems that technology is moving faster than it has in years past, that's undoubtedly true when you compare the present to the industrial age, or even just look at the last 10 years. You can look at the US patent applications over the last 100 years and see another hockey stick, which probably coincides, by the way, with a hockey stick in lawyers in patent applications. But don't take my word for it. Just think about your own life and the things that you use. None of these companies are 10 years old, or they're just turning 10 years old, like Uber and Lyft. Now, I see a lot of iPads out there. I don't see a lot of Snapchat or Instagram users, I'm going to guess. Those tend to be millennials. And as we all know, millennials are different. And every generation, of course, brings their own flavors to the world. But this generation, those in their 20s and early 30s, is bigger. It's a bigger cohort than those in the past, somewhat like the baby boomers. And they've grown up in a time of unprecedented technological interconnectedness, which makes their impact on the world arguably greater than that of Gen Xers like me. And some of the things that we're following in these cultural changes, some of the millennial tropes that are out there, are a preference for experiences versus goods. And that's why we're focused on things like live entertainment and sports and esports in particular. And all this is, of course, enabled by another focus of ours, mobility and gadgets like these, which we're not focused on. This is a Gabelli out-of-the-office analyst, by the way, who's checking with Mario. There's also been a propensity to share assets, unprecedented, and really enabled by the evolution of technology, which has reduced transaction costs and reduced friction costs. So that guy probably rented his condo through Airbnb and took an Uber to the beach. But you can share almost anything, obviously bikes, even dresses. And this has some pretty profound implications for companies in the auto sector, amongst others, and we'll hear a little bit more about that later. And then finally, just try to get a straw around here, and you'll realize how important Mother Earth is to the younger generations and to many in the older generations, obviously, as well. And that's why, as Mario mentioned, we're focusing on ESG, environmental, social governance factors, in all of our analysis, and offer a strategy with specifically that thrust. Again, more on that later. This is not Bob Dylan, but the times indeed are a-changing, but they've always been changing. We fought in the span of a generation, World War I on horses, and World War II with nukes. And I would argue, as Professor Schumpeter did, that change is necessary for a healthy capitalistic system. In fact, you look at disruptive companies like Netflix, they've been great for capitalism. They've been great for society because they've not only led to greater consumer surplus, but they've spurred some of the erstwhile losers like Disney and CBS to innovate and make better, more durable products. And the broadband infrastructure companies like Comcast and Charter who invest in their networks make them faster, more profitable, and more valuable. The reality is that the cable companies should actually be sending flowers to Netflix, in my view. You can also see this just in a snapshot of the evolution of the S&P 500. These are the top 5 companies in the S&P 500 20 and 40 years ago, and I picked those periods not just because they coincide with roughly the history of our firm, but because the oil crisis, the second oil crisis in 1979, and the first internet boom in 99 were certainly disruptive times. And there's a lot here. We can make a lot of observations. I'll limit it to two. First, the economy has dramatically shifted from capital-heavy industrial companies to intellect-heavy service companies. And that's probably not going to change, and that's probably, by the way, a good thing. Some have even argued that that's a reason for higher multiples. Second, companies that seem indomitable at one point in time rarely are. And you can see the list here, the change that's taken place. I would make a bet with anyone in this room that when we come back in 2039, none of these companies will be on the list. Maybe two, but certainly no more than two. You can see me after, we could put the money in gusto. But how do we invest in that kind of world? Well, it's really not that different from investing in 1977 or 79, value 1.0 or 2.0. We're taking our circles of competence and the accumulated compounded knowledge we have in those areas and harnessing them to uncover hidden assets, underappreciated drivers of change, like old companies taking new technology and using to disrupt their own businesses, and perhaps most importantly, adaptable management. Managements that can change their business on the fly, many like those who we're honoring in our Hall of Fame, who have deployed capital wisely. And we're combining that, again, with a discipline in what we pay to own a business. And we're doing that with companies that perhaps look a little bit different than 40 years ago, but that's really the heart of Value 3.0. And to talk a bit more about those companies and some of those dynamics is my partner, Kevin Dreyer.